So with social media algorithms, right, these are recommender systems. Think of YouTube, for example, that loads up the next video. You watch one video and another one comes along and loads up and starts playing. So the algorithms learn how to choose that content, whether it's content for your news feed or whatever it is on Twitter. And they do that in order to optimize some objective. So click-through is one, the sort of total number of clicks that we're going to get from this user over time. It could be engagement, the amount of time the user engages with the platform, and there are other metrics being used. And you might think, okay, to maximize click-through, then the system has to learn what people want, which is sort of good, right? Sounds helpful. But we quickly learned, actually, that that's not what's going on, right? That it's not what people want, it's what people will click on, which means that the systems learn to actually promote clickbait because they got more clicks out of it, and so they like that kind of content. And we very quickly learned about this idea of the filter bubble, where you start to only see things that you're already comfortable with, and so you become narrower and narrower in your understanding of the world. But that's not the optimal solution either, right? If you know anything about reinforcement learning, you know that reinforcement learning systems learn to produce sequences of actions that generate the maximum sum of rewards over time. And those sequences of actions change the environment in which the agent operates. So what is the environment that the recommender system is operating in? It's your brain, right? That's the environment. And so it learns to find a sequence of actions that changes your brain so that in the long run you produce the largest number of clicks, right? This is just a theorem, right, about how those learning systems will behave. So they simply modify people to be more predictable by sequences of thousands of nudges over time. And at least anecdotally, people have reported that this can happen quite quickly, that your nice Midwestern, middle-of-the-road granny, in a few months can be reading the Daily Stormer and posting on neo-fascist websites. And these algorithms are really stupid, right? They don't know that people exist. They don't know that we have minds or political opinions. They don't understand the content of what they're sending to us, right? If we made the AI systems better, the outcome would be much worse, right? And in fact, this is a theorem that one of my students, it's off the bottom, sorry. So Dylan Hadfield-Manel and Simon Zhuang proved this theorem, very simple theorem saying that when the objectives are misaligned, optimizing the wrong objective makes the situation worse with respect to the true objective under fairly mild and general conditions. So we need to get rid of the standard model. So we need a different model, right? This is the standard model. Machines are intelligent to the extent their actions can be expected to achieve their objectives. Instead, we need the machines to be beneficial to us, right? We don't want this sort of pure intelligence that once it has the objective is off doing its thing, right? We want the systems to be beneficial, meaning that their actions can be expected to achieve our objectives. And how do we do that? Well, it's not as impossible as it sounds, right? So I'm going to do this in two ways. One is in sort of an Asimovian style, saying here are some principles, right? So the first principle is that the robot's only objective is to satisfy human preferences. And preferences here is not just what kind of pizza do you like, but which future of the universe do you prefer, right? What is your ranking over probability distributions over all, complete futures of the universe? So it's a very complex and abstract mathematical object, but that's what the objective of the robot should be. If you prefer a less technical notion, think of it as to further human interests. But the key point is number two, that the machine knows that it doesn't know what those preferences are. Right? That you do not build in a fixed known objective up front. Instead, the machine knows that it doesn't know what the objective is. But it still needs a way of grounding its choices over the long run. And the evidence about human preferences will say flows from human behavior. So I'll talk a little bit more about that. So these three principles actually can be turned into a mathematical framework, and it's similar for the economists in the room, Ben. It's similar to the idea of what's called a principal-agent game, except in principal-agent games, the agent is typically thought of as another human, and you're trying to get the human to be useful to the principal. So how do you do that even when they don't have the same objectives? But here, we actually get to design the agent, and we'll see that the agent doesn't need to have any objectives of their own. So in some ways, it's actually easier. So we call this an assistance game. So it involves at least one person, at least one machine, and the machine is designed to be of assistance to the human. So let's have a look at that in a little bit more depth. So we've got some number of humans, M, and they have their utilities, U1 through UM, which we can think of as preferences about what the future should be. And then we have some machines, or robots, N of those. And the robots, in order to, right, their goal is to further human interests. So if I was a utilitarian, I would say the collective human interest is the sum of the utilities of the individual humans. We could have other definitions if you prefer different ways of aggregating preferences. The key point is there's a priori uncertainty about what those utility functions are. So it's got to optimize something, but it doesn't know what it is. And if you solve the game, in principle, you can just solve these games offline and then look at the solution and how it behaves. And as the solution unfolds, effectively information about the human utilities is flowing at runtime based on the human actions. And the humans can do deliberate actions to try to convey information, and that's part of the solution of the game. They can give commands. They can prohibit you from doing things. They can reward you for doing the right thing. In fact, in GPT-4, that's one of the main methods, is basically good dog and bad dog. That's how they get GPT-4 to behave itself and not say bad things. Is just by saying bad dog whenever it says a bad thing, right? In some sense, the entire record, the written record of humanity is a record of humans doing things and other people being upset about it, right? All of that information is useful for understanding what human preference structures really are. Algorithmically, we can solve these, and in fact, the one machine, one human game can be reduced to a partially observable MDP, and for small versions of that, we can solve it exactly and actually look at the equilibrium of the game and how the agents behave. But an important point here, and the word alignment often is used in discussing these kinds of things, and as Ken mentioned, it's related to inverse reinforcement learning, the learning of human preference structures by observing behavior. But alignment gives you this idea that we're going to align the machine and the human, and then off they go, right? That's never going to happen in practice. The machines are always going to have considerable uncertainty about human preference structures, right? Partly because there are just whole areas of the universe where there's no experience and no evidence from human behavior about how we would behave or how we would choose in those circumstances. And of course, we don't know our own preferences in those areas. In Human Compatible, the book that Ken mentioned, I used durian as an example. Durian is a fruit that some people love and some people despise to an extreme degree, right? Either the most sublime fruit the world is capable of producing, or skunk spray, sewage stale vomit and use surgical swabs, right? These are the words people use. So I tried it. I was in Singapore last week, so I tried durian for the first time. I'm actually right in the middle, right? I'm not at one end or the other. Okay, but before that, I literally didn't know my preferences, and I learned something about them as a result. So when you look at these solutions, how does the robot behave if it's playing this game? It actually defers to human requests and commands. It behaves cautiously because it doesn't want to mess with parts of the world where it's not sure about your preferences. In the extreme case, it's willing to be switched off. So I'm going to have to, in the interest of time, I'm going to have to skip over the proof of that, which is proved with a little game. But basically, we can show very straightforwardly that as long as the robot is uncertain about how the human is going to choose, then it has a positive incentive to allow itself to be switched off. Right? It gains information by leaving that choice available for the human. And it only closes off that choice when it has, well, or at least when it believes it has, perfect knowledge of human preferences. So there's many more extensions, right? The most obvious issue here is what happens when we have many humans. As I mentioned, one option is to optimize the, the sum of utilities, but that's an oversimplified solution. And you have to be quite careful. So if you've ever seen the Avengers movie where Thanos, right, he collects these Infinity Stones. Once he's got them all, he's got this plan, right? A very rational plan, or so he thinks, right? Which is that if there were half as many people in the universe, the remaining people would be more than twice as happy. So as a good, naive utilitarian, he clicks his fingers, gets rid of half the people in the universe. Okay, so the Financial Times review of the movie is Thanos gives economics a bad name. Right? So we, as AI systems reach these sort of Thanos levels of power, we had better figure this out, right, before we get there, and not implement naive solutions to these kinds of very important questions. There are issues to do with making sure that when we have lots of systems game solvers in the world at the same time, from many different manufacturers, that they don't accidentally get into strategic interactions with each other. We have to take into account the real psychology, the real cognitive architecture of humans, which is what's generating their behavior, which is what's providing evidence about their underlying preferences. So you have to be able to invert that correctly. Since we're getting rid of the standard model, right, that's an enormous pain for me, because in writing the textbook, right, all the major chapters of the textbook assume the standard model. Right? If you think about search and problem solving, you assume a cost function and a goal test, right? But what if you don't know what the cost function and the goal test should be? Well, then we've got to rewrite that whole chapter. We've got to rewrite Markov decision processes and reinforcement learning and supervised learning and all the other branches of AI that rely on knowing the objective up front. And then if we develop successful and capable technologies on this foundation, we've then got to make sure that they actually get used, that regulations are developed to ensure that unsafe versions of AI systems are not deployed.